It was a crisp autumn morning when Mr. Harris arrived at the bank. He was an elderly man with a head full of silver hair, and his weathered face bore the marks of a life well lived, lines etched by decades of hard work and experience. Clutching a well-worn leather bag, he made his way slowly towards the entrance, his old bicycle resting against the wall just outside the bank. A modern glass structure that gleamed in the early light stood in stark contrast to the humble man approaching it. As he wheeled his bicycle to a stop, a security guard stationed near the entrance glanced up and immediately frowned. He was young, in his late 20s, and it was clear from his stance and the way he sized up Mr. Harris that he wasn't particularly used to seeing someone like him at this establishment. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said curtly, stepping forward to block the entrance. "Can I help you?" Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses and smiled warmly. "I'm here to deposit some money," he replied gently. The guard looked at him with a mix of suspicion and confusion. It was hard for him to reconcile the image of this old man, with his tattered clothes and bicycle, with someone coming to make a deposit. He probably thought Mr. Harris was just another street dweller asking for handouts. "You can't just walk in here like that," the guard said, his tone sharp and dismissive. "I'll have to call someone." Mr. Harris, without a hint of offense, nodded calmly. "Of course," he said. "But I assure you, I'm not here for what you think." The young security guard hesitated. There was a slight unease in his posture, as if he didn't quite know how to handle the situation. After a few moments of silent deliberation, he relented, though not entirely convinced. "I'll have someone come check," the guard said, stepping aside just enough for Mr. Harris to enter the building. Inside, the atmosphere was much warmer. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee from the small cafe in the corner, and soft classical music played in the background. The young woman at the front desk, her name tag reading Emma, looked up from her computer screen as the door opened. "Good morning, sir. How may I help you?" she asked, her voice bright and professional. Mr. Harris approached the counter, where Emma had already taken a seat. He gave her another warm, reassuring smile. "I'd like to make a deposit," he said. From the bag he was carrying, he pulled out an old, faded savings book, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. Emma raised an eyebrow, but her smile never wavered. "Of course, sir. If you'll just give me a moment to check." But as she opened the savings book, her eyes widened in disbelief. She had been expecting the usual small deposits, modest savings accounts. However, the number staring up at her from the page was anything but ordinary. It was a sum that would make any banker pause, a balance of tens of millions of dollars. For a moment, she was silent. Her fingers hovered over the page, as though she was seeing things. Her gaze darted between the number and Mr. Harris's calm, unassuming face. The elderly man, with his humble appearance and gentle demeanor, had somehow accumulated a fortune far more than anyone could have imagined. "Sir," she said, her voice tinged with surprise, "I think there's been some mistake. I'll need to call my manager." Mr. Harris nodded, understanding the confusion, and didn't speak a word as she stepped away to fetch the manager. Emma hurried over to Manager Blake's office, where she knocked quickly and stepped inside. The manager, a tall man with short-cropped brown hair, looked up from his desk. He was in his mid-30s and had the air of someone who was always busy, always thinking a few steps ahead. Emma handed him the savings book, still unsure if she was seeing things correctly. "Blake, you've got to come see this," she said, her voice a little shaky. Manager Blake glanced down at the book, his eyebrows furrowing in disbelief. He blinked several times, scanning the numbers again. It didn't make sense. No one in their right mind would believe that someone like Mr. Harris could have such a large sum of money. "Is this for real?" Blake asked, half to himself. Emma nodded, her eyes wide with astonishment. "I thought I was seeing things." Blake stood up abruptly and walked toward the counter where Mr. Harris was still waiting, as calm as ever. His expression was a mixture of confusion and suspicion. He had no idea what to make of the situation. As he approached the counter, Mr. Harris rose to his feet, offering a polite nod. "Good morning, sir," Blake said, extending his hand. "I'm Blake. It seems there's been some confusion. We're not accustomed to seeing accounts like yours at this bank." Mr. Harris smiled gently, shaking his hand. "I understand. I'm sure this is surprising." Blake raised an eyebrow, still skeptical. "Surprising is an understatement. If you don't mind me asking, how did you come to accumulate this kind of wealth?" Mr. Harris glanced over at Emma, who was still standing nearby, and then looked back at Blake, his eyes softening. "It's a long story," he began, his voice rich with the weight of years and experience. "But I'll tell you, if you're willing to listen." Blake nodded, though he still wasn't entirely sure what to think. "Of course," he said, his curiosity piqued. Mr. Harris settled back into his chair, his hands folding neatly in his lap as if he were preparing to share a cherished memory. There was a calmness in his demeanor that suggested he had lived through countless such conversations, each one carrying a quiet wisdom that only comes with age. "Well," he began slowly, his voice low but steady, "it all started many years ago, back when I was younger, and life was much simpler." Blake, now intrigued, took a seat across from Mr. Harris, motioning for Emma to join them. She stood at a distance, clearly curious but unsure whether she should stay or leave. Emma chose to remain, her presence still a quiet observer of the unfolding story. "I grew up in a small town, just outside of Portland," Mr. Harris continued. "My family was modest. My father worked as a mechanic. My mother ran a small diner. We didn't have much, but we never went without. My father always told me that money wasn't the most important thing, but what you did with it when you had it was what mattered most." Blake leaned forward slightly, his skepticism easing, replaced by a genuine curiosity. "So, you've always had money, then?" he asked, trying to piece together how this elderly man could have accrued such an immense fortune. Mr. Harris shook his head slowly, his eyes distant as he remembered the past. "Not at all. It wasn't until I met George that things started to change." He paused, clearly collecting his thoughts. Blake and Emma exchanged glances, intrigued by the name. "George was an old friend," Mr. Harris continued. "We'd known each other since high school. We didn't share much in common. He came from a wealthy family, had the best education, the finest things in life. I, on the other hand, had nothing but determination and a sense of pride in my work. But we were close, almost like brothers." Blake, now fully invested in the story, leaned in. "What happened with George?" Mr. Harris smiled a little, his eyes lighting up at the memory. "George had it all, but he didn't have the one thing that mattered. He didn't know how to manage his success. Over the years, he made poor investments, surrounded himself with people who only wanted to take advantage of him. Soon, he was in deep debt, on the verge of losing everything." "Did you help him?" Emma asked, her voice soft with empathy. Mr. Harris nodded. "I did. Yes. I couldn't stand to watch him destroy his life. So, I offered to help him out. I didn't have much at the time, just a modest savings account from years of hard work, but I knew I could lend him enough to get back on his feet." Blake's eyebrows raised in surprise. "You loaned him money? When you didn't have much yourself?" Mr. Harris smiled faintly. "I suppose it seems like a risky move, doesn't it? But that's what friends do. I believed in George, and I believed he could turn things around." He took a deep breath, as if the weight of the memory was still with him. "It wasn't easy, and it took years for him to regain his footing. But he did. And in time, he was able to pay me back, along with interest. And then, as a token of his gratitude, he gave me something more, his father's old investment portfolio. George had a wealth of stocks and bonds that his father had left him. And at the time, no one thought they were worth much. But George trusted me to manage them. Emma blinked in surprise. You didn't just help him, you changed your own future in the process. Mr. Harris nodded, a slight grin tugging at his lips. Exactly. Those investments grew over the years. What had once been a handful of seemingly insignificant stocks turned into something far more valuable. I used the profits to invest in other things, real estate, businesses, a little bit of everything. Eventually, I found myself in a position where I could not only support myself but help others too. Blake, now completely captivated by the story, leaned back in his chair. So that's how you ended up with all this money? He asked, gesturing to the savings book. Mr. Harris chuckled softly. Not quite. I didn't seek wealth for its own sake. But as I became more successful, I realized something important. It wasn't about having money, it was about what you did with it. And so, I started investing in people, in causes that mattered. I started a scholarship fund for young people from my town, supported local charities, and helped others who were down on their luck. Just as I once helped George. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. I've lived a simple life, Blake. I don't need all the luxuries in the world. But I've always believed that money should be used for something greater than yourself. Blake sat in stunned silence, his mind racing to fully comprehend what he had just heard. The elderly man sitting before him was not just a successful businessman, he was someone who had dedicated his life to helping others, to making the world a better place in ways that few people ever consider. Emma, too, was deeply moved. She had started the day thinking that Mr. Harris was just another elderly man with a quaint story. But now she saw him as something much more, someone whose kindness and generosity had shaped the course of his life and left a lasting impact on those around him. Blake, Mr. Harris said gently, breaking the silence. There's one thing I want you to understand. Above all else, you should never judge a person by their appearance or their past. We all have the potential for greatness. But what matters is how we use what we have. I've always tried to live by that. And I hope you'll remember it too. Blake looked into Mr. Harris's eyes. And for the first time, he understood. It wasn't about the money or the bank balance, it was about the heart behind it. The intention. And the way it was used to better the lives of others. The true wealth, Blake realized, lay not in numbers, but in kindness. Thank you, Mr. Harris, Blake said, his voice sincere. I think I've learned more from you in the past few minutes than I have in years of working in this industry. Mr. Harris smiled, his eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction. I'm glad to hear that, Blake. But remember, it's never too late to start using your wealth for good. That's what will bring you peace in the end. As Mr. Harris spoke, the weight of his words settled in the room like a quiet storm. Blake's mind was racing, his perception of wealth shifting in ways he hadn't imagined before. The young manager, once skeptical, now saw things through a different lens, a lens of empathy, understanding, and the deeper values that connected people in ways money could never achieve. Mr. Harris sat there, an embodiment of wisdom and simplicity. His face, though etched with the years of time, carried an ageless quality that spoke of a life well lived. His stories, rich with lessons about generosity and kindness, were more than just anecdotes, they were reminders of what truly mattered in life. For a long moment, there was a silence between them. Blake could feel the story's weight pressing on his heart. He had heard many success stories in his time, stories of people who climbed the ladder of wealth with ruthlessness and ambition. But this was something different. Mr. Harris wasn't just telling him about money or investments, he was telling him about the human spirit. About the power of gratitude and humility. Emma, too, felt the impact of Mr. Harris's words. She had come into the meeting prepared to take notes, to learn about financial strategies or maybe hear an investment tip or two. But what she had encountered was a lesson far more valuable, the importance of using one's resources wisely, not for self-gain, but to help others. Blake leaned back in his chair, absorbing the quiet strength of the elderly man's presence. "Mr. Harris," he began, his voice quieter now, "you've given me so much to think about. I've spent my career focused on growth, on profits, but I've never really stopped to consider how much more I could give back." Mr. Harris smiled, his gaze softening. "That's what I want you to remember, Blake. There's always more to life than just accumulating. What we do with what we have defines us. It's about the lives we touch, the good we spread." Blake nodded, though there was a sense of discomfort in his heart. He had never seen himself as selfish. But Mr. Harris's words made him question his priorities. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, making decisions based on the bottom line, sometimes at the expense of his own values. He had helped a few charities over the years, but it had always felt more like a token gesture than a true commitment to making the world a better place. "You're right," Blake said finally. "I've been so focused on building the business, on maintaining success, that I've never really thought about how my success could impact others. I've always believed that the best way to help is through financial support, but maybe that's not the only way. Maybe there are other ways I can make a difference." Emma, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "I think you're beginning to see it, Blake. It's not just about the money. It's about the ripple effect we create with the choices we make. Every action, no matter how small, can make a difference in someone's life." Mr. Harris nodded, his face glowing with a quiet satisfaction. "Exactly, Emma. Life isn't measured by the amount of wealth you accumulate, but by the positive change you create. And that starts with gratitude and humility. It starts with recognizing the gifts you've been given, not just material gifts, but the ability to impact others." Blake sat there in silence for a moment, reflecting. He thought back to the many years he had spent building his career. He thought about his own father, who had worked hard his entire life but never let go of his core values of integrity and kindness. Perhaps, Blake mused, he had lost sight of those values in his pursuit of success. He looked at Mr. Harris and Emma, feeling a sense of clarity beginning to form. "I think the next step for me is learning how to give not just money, but my time, my energy, my knowledge. There are so many people out there who could benefit from a little guidance, from someone who genuinely cares." Mr. Harris's eyes sparkled. "That's the spirit, Blake. It's never too late to start. And remember, it's not about the grand gestures. It's about the small, everyday acts of kindness. Helping someone get back on their feet. Providing support when it's needed most. Being there for others without expecting anything in return." Blake smiled, a sense of peace washing over him. He had learned something in this brief meeting that had eluded him for years. True success, he realized, wasn't found in a balance sheet, it was found in the lives you touched and the difference you made. Emma, too, felt a sense of fulfillment. She had entered the room as an observer, but she was leaving with a new understanding of what it meant to be truly wealthy. It wasn't the numbers on a screen or the weight of an inheritance, it was the depth of human connection, the acts of kindness, and the willingness to give without expecting anything in return. Mr. Harris's words stayed with them both long after the meeting ended. As they left the bank that day, Blake's mind was no longer consumed by thoughts of profits and losses. Instead, it was filled with a new kind of ambition, the ambition to use his resources, his knowledge, and his position to create a positive impact on the world. And as for Emma, she knew that her own journey had just begun. She had always been driven. But now she understood that true success wasn't about climbing the corporate ladder. It was about building something far more lasting, an enduring legacy of compassion, gratitude, and humility. Together, the two of them walked into the future, not with the weight of ambition on their shoulders, but with the lightness of purpose in their hearts. The meeting with Mr. Harris had left Blake and Emma both changed. But there was still one more piece of the puzzle to address, something that would test the depth of the lessons they'd learned that day. The quiet weight of Mr. Harris's presence seemed to linger in the air. even as the conversation was about to shift towards something far more practical. Blake was beginning to realize that the road ahead would require more than just understanding, it would require action. Before we wrap up, Blake, Mr. Harris said, his voice steady but filled with intention. There's one more thing I'd like to discuss with you. Blake raised an eyebrow. Of course. Mr. Harris. What's on your mind? Mr. Harris leaned forward. His hands folded neatly on the table. His eyes, still sharp and full of purpose, looked at Blake directly. You've heard what I've said about gratitude, about the responsibility we all share in making the world a better place. But it's one thing to understand these ideas, it's another to put them into practice. I'm asking you for a promise. Blake felt a subtle shift in the room. He had thought they were done, that the lesson was complete. But now, it seemed there was a deeper commitment being requested. He glanced at Emma, who was equally attentive, her expression reflecting the seriousness of the moment. Mr. Harris continued. You've got the resources. Blake. You've got the influence. You've got the ability to make a difference. But it's not enough just to talk about it. I want you to take what you have, this account, the interest it generates, and create something that will give back. A fund. A charitable cause. I want you to commit to using this wealth to help those who truly need it. And I want you to do it without expecting anything in return. Not for reputation. Not for recognition, just because it's the right thing to do. Blake's heart skipped a beat. He had expected many things in this meeting. But this was a responsibility. A challenge in its truest sense. Mr. Harris. Blake said. The weight of the words suddenly heavy in his mouth. Are you asking me to give away a portion of my wealth? He knew the answer before the question was fully formed. But it still felt important to ask. I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Harris replied. I'm asking for a commitment to use what you have to create something lasting. Think of it as an investment. But not in stocks or real estate, an investment in the human spirit. In those who need a hand up. You've already benefited from the kindness of others. Blake. It's time for you to do the same. Blake sat in stunned silence. The enormity of what Mr. Harris was asking settling around him. In that moment, he realized that the fund wasn't just about money, it was a legacy. It was a call to action that would forever change the trajectory of his life. His mind flashed to all the ways he had justified his wealth, how he had framed it as a reward for hard work. For sacrifice. For a life well lived. But Mr. Harris was showing him that there was a higher calling to wealth. One that wasn't about accumulation at all. What would you suggest, Mr. Harris? Emma interjected, breaking the silence. How would we even start something like this? Mr. Harris smiled, his eyes twinkling. I've been thinking about this for a long time. I want you to use the interest from this account not as an afterthought, but as a foundational investment in a cause. A cause that resonates with you. Something that speaks to your heart. And I want you to start small. You don't have to build an empire overnight. But you have to begin. Blake looked at Emma again. Her gaze soft. But resolute. She was in this with him, whatever they decided to do. They would do it together. The thought made the task ahead seem a little less daunting. I promise. Blake said. Finally finding his voice. I promise to take this seriously. I promise to create something meaningful, something that will help those in need. And I won't stop there. Mr. Harris nodded slowly, his face breaking into a warm, knowing smile. Good. That's what I wanted to hear. Blake took a deep breath, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The challenge was clear now, and it was one he could no longer ignore. But he wasn't afraid. He knew that this was the right path, one that would lead him towards the kind of success that would matter in the long run. Emma, who had been quiet for a few moments, added, We'll need a name for the fund. Something that embodies the spirit of what we're trying to do. Blake turned to her, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. How about the Legacy Fund? It feels right. We'll build something that lasts, not for us, but for others. Mr. Harris nodded approvingly. I think that's perfect. A legacy is something that endures. Something that continues to give long after we're gone. As they stood to leave the meeting, Blake felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. The world, once full of just business transactions and profit margins, now felt rich with possibilities. And for the first time, he truly understood the weight of responsibility that came with wealth. Blake and Emma walked out of the room side by side, the seed of their future endeavor planted firmly in their minds. They didn't know what the road ahead would look like, but they were certain of one thing: they had started down a path that would change everything. The days that followed the meeting with Mr. Harris were filled with a mixture of excitement and contemplation. Blake had always been someone who approached life with an analytical mind, weighing decisions carefully, often at the expense of deeper emotions. But now, as he and Emma sat together at the kitchen table, brainstorming ideas for the legacy fund, he felt an unfamiliar sense of urgency, a calling that wasn't born from spreadsheets and strategies but from something more profound, more human. They had already agreed on the basics. The fund would be focused on supporting education for underprivileged children, something Blake had always felt strongly about but never acted upon. It made sense. Education was the key that unlocked the door to opportunity. And every child, no matter their background, deserved that chance. But as they sifted through different causes and debated the scope of their mission, Blake felt the weight of Mr. Harris's words pressing on him. It's not just about giving money. It's about creating something that will change lives. Something that will outlast you. Blake paused, pushing the papers aside. Emma, how do we make sure this isn't just another charity? How do we make it meaningful? Emma, always the more intuitive one, sat back in her chair and smiled gently. It starts with sincerity. It's about more than writing a check or creating a program. It's about being involved, staying engaged, and ensuring that the money we invest actually makes a difference. We need to be hands-on, Blake. We can't just delegate this. It has to come from the heart. Blake nodded, her words resonating with him in a way that nothing else had. He'd always known that wealth wasn't just about accumulation, but the real depth of that knowledge was only just starting to sink in. He couldn't change the world on his own, but through the Legacy Fund, he could be a part of something bigger. It was an opportunity to use what he had to give others the same chance he'd been given, an opportunity to make a lasting impact. The first major step was to set up the fund. It wasn't going to be easy, and there were 1,000 details to figure out. But Blake felt a sense of purpose now that he hadn't before. There was no going back. And for the first time in his life, he was excited about the challenge ahead. But the most important part, he realized, was not the logistics or the framework, it was the relationships. Blake didn't need to be a billionaire to make a difference. All he needed was a commitment to follow through. And Emma's unwavering support gave him the courage to take that step. Over the next few weeks, they worked tirelessly, meeting with financial advisors, setting up the proper legal structures, and reaching out to communities and schools that might benefit from the fund. It was harder than either of them expected, but they were determined. And with every conversation, every small victory, Blake felt his understanding of wealth and purpose shifting. It wasn't long before the Legacy Fund gained attention from local organizations and even some larger foundations. But despite the growing recognition, Blake stayed grounded, focusing on what mattered most, making sure that the children they helped had access to the education and resources they needed to succeed. One evening, as they were wrapping up a meeting with a potential partner, Blake looked out the window and saw the sun setting behind the skyline of the city. It was a beautiful view, one he had seen countless times before. But tonight, something was different. He was no longer just a man standing on the edge of success, wondering what it all meant. He was part of something greater than himself, something that had the potential to change lives. As he turned to Emma, he saw the same realization in her eyes. We're doing something real, aren't we? He asked, his voice filled with a quiet wonder. Emma smiled softly. Yes, We are. And this is just the beginning. And in that moment, Blake knew that everything he had built, every success and failure, had led him here not to a life of wealth for its own sake, but to a life where he could give back, where he could create a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. The journey wasn't going to be easy. There would be obstacles, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But Blake had come to understand that the true value of his wealth wasn't in what it could buy, it was in what it could give. And with that realization, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he was finally on the path that truly mattered. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Blake and Emma sat together, ready to face the future not with fear or uncertainty, but with the courage that comes from knowing you're exactly where you need to be. The Legacy Fund had become their new purpose. And with it, they would build a future that was both meaningful and lasting. Blake sat quietly in the living room, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. The months that had passed since the creation of the Legacy Fund had been both transformative and challenging. He could still recall the uncertainty he felt when Mr. Harris first spoke to him, how he had struggled to reconcile his wealth with his sense of purpose. But now, sitting in the comfort of his own home, he realized how far he had come. The journey wasn't linear. There were moments of doubt when he questioned if he was doing enough or if they were truly making a difference. But those were the moments that had pushed him to keep going, to dig deeper, to stay connected to the real mission of the fund, creating opportunities for children who needed it most. He had learned that success wasn't about numbers in a bank account or accolades. It was about impact, real, lasting change. As he reflected on it all, one thought stood out: purpose was the key. He had spent so much time building his career around the idea of success, thinking that the more he achieved, the more fulfilled he would feel. But now, he understood that purpose was what brought fulfillment. True success wasn't about reaching the top. It was about lifting others along the way. About finding meaning in how you used your resources, talents, and influence. Blake's eyes lingered on the framed photo on the mantel, the smiling faces of the first group of children whose scholarships had been funded by the Legacy Fund. He had never felt prouder of anything in his life. The phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Emma. The new partnership is official. We're ready to expand. Blake smiled and quickly typed back. We're just getting started. Across town, Emma was sitting in her own office, glancing over the newly signed agreements for the fund's next phase. Her heart was full, not from the success, but from the journey itself. Working alongside Blake had been an eye-opening experience. She had always been passionate about social causes, but seeing Blake's growth, his willingness to change, and his commitment to something larger than himself had deepened her own sense of purpose. Emma had always believed that true success was about building something that lasts. But what Blake had taught her was that it wasn't just about longevity, it was about integrity, humility, and the impact you made in the process. She had seen him evolve from someone who was unsure of his role in the world to someone who embraced it with all his heart. She smiled as she reflected on their conversations. Blake's struggle to reconcile his wealth with his newfound sense of purpose had been difficult. But watching him push through his doubts and come to the realization that wealth could be a tool for change had been inspiring. For Emma, the most important lesson was the value of connection. She'd always known that people were the key to meaningful change. But Blake's journey had reinforced that belief. Real success came not from working in isolation, but from collaborating. From listening to the voices of the people you sought to help. It was about staying humble, staying grounded, and remembering that change didn't happen overnight. It was built piece by piece, with every decision, every partnership, and every relationship. As Mr. Harris sat on his porch that evening, he thought back to the day he had met Blake. He hadn't expected to see such a transformation. At first, Blake had struck him as just another wealthy businessman looking to tick off a few boxes for his public image. But he had been wrong. Over time, Blake had demonstrated that wealth wasn't something to hoard, it was something to share. Mr. Harris had long believed that the true measure of a person was how they used their influence to help others. He had seen many people who had wealth but lacked the wisdom to use it for good. Blake, though, had proven him wrong. In his willingness to change, to evolve, and to take real action, Blake had become a living testament to the power of redemption and purpose. The old man thought about the lessons he had learned throughout his own life. Don't judge people too quickly. He had seen too many examples of people misjudged based on their appearance or status. But Blake had shown that change was always possible, even in the most unlikely of people. He smiled to himself. It was moments like these that made life worthwhile. To see someone use their privilege for the benefit of others, now that was the real reward. The lessons were clear to each of them now. Blake had learned that purpose wasn't just something you found, it was something you created through action. Emma had learned that success was never just about the destination, but about the people you brought with you along the way. And Mr. Harris, as always, had been reminded that change was possible, no matter how set in your ways you might be. As Blake and Emma continued to work side by side on the legacy fund, they knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But they were ready. For they had discovered something far greater than wealth. They had discovered the power of purpose, of love, and of connection, things that no amount of money could ever buy. And as for Mr. Harris, he found peace in knowing that, sometimes, the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't the wealth we accumulate, but the lives we touch along the way. And in that realization, they all found the true meaning of success.